Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. And today, what I'll be going to present to you is all about the new classification of non-experimental quantitative research. But before we begin, let's watch first this video presentation about the introductions to research method. Let's begin.
Welcome to Introduction to Research Methods. Start your journey in the world of research. On a daily basis, we look up information on the internet, ask friends, browse consumer magazines, or read reviews before we decide what phone to buy, where to get the best burgers in town, which route will take us to school faster, and how the weather might look over the weekend. In the simplest terms, research is searching for and gathering information, usually to answer a particular question or problem. Unlike the day-to-day search for information to buy a phone or look up the fastest route to school, academic research is a systematic and organized process. It is based on empirical data, and its goal is to verify or generate theories. At a general level, academic research has 3 steps or stages: posing a question, collecting data to answer the question, and presenting the answer to the question. Throughout your program, you will write research papers, compare studies, prepare literature reviews on various topics, and you might even get to design and conduct a study of your own. This introductory course will prepare you for all of that. In this course, you will learn the fundamentals about research. You will learn how to perform research and how to use the results of academic studies in your papers and projects. We will discuss questions such as, what does research involve? What the qualitative approach to research is all about. What does quantitative research mean? How can you design and conduct research studies that follow the ethical standards and academic guidelines? What are some main methods to collect data? Academic research is at the heart of academia, and developing a solid understanding of it is necessary for success in your program. Let's get started and enjoy the world of research.
There you have it, my dear students, about the introduction of research. And now to proceed, let's now have the presentation about the new classification of non-experimental quantitative research. By the way, I'm Mr. Joseph D. Reyes from Philippine Normal University, National Center for Teacher Education. And to start with, let's have now an overview about a new classification of non-experimental quantitative research. But before that, let us identify the different key ideas for this discussion. Number 1. Non-experimental research is used when variables of interest can be manipulated because they are attributes variables, or when random assignment of individual to a given treatment condition would be unethical. Another key ideas are the term causal comparative research and correlational research from our research methods textbooks are misleading in terms of causality issues. Non-experimental studies may be classified along 2 dimensions: one based on the purpose of the study, and the other on the time frame of the data collection. Now let's proceed to the 2 types of research, which are causal comparative and correlational research in literature. Starting with the causal comparative research includes a categorical independent and/or dependent variable, whereas correlational only includes quantitative variable. So this is a good example of causal comparative research. Example, what causes lung cancer? The finding, people with lung cancer smoke more than people without lung cancer. There are no other differences in lifestyle characteristics between the groups. Conclusion, smoking is a possible cause of lung cancer. Caution, a third factor or a proper matching. Another meaning for the causal comparative and correlational research, according to Gay and Iratian 2000, causal comparative studies attempt to establish cause and effect relationships and involve comparisons, whereas correlational studies involve relationship and never establishes cause-effect links between variables. Another definition, cause or causal comparative always involves the comparisons of two or more groups, whereas correlational research involves collecting data in order to determine whether or and to what degree a relationship exists between two or more quantifiable variables. Another definition of causal comparative and correlational research as their comparison, according to Charles, causal comparative research strongly suggests cause and effect, but correlational research can only be used to examine the possible existence of causation. Another, causal comparative can suggest causality more persuasively than correlational, but less persuasively than experimental. Another definition for the causal comparative research and correlational research as their comparison, according to Martellia et al. 1999, in causal comparative research, no attempt is made to isolate the effects of a manipulable independent variable on the dependent variable, whereas in correlational research, there is usually just one group, or at least groups are not compared. Another, causal comparative research has a categorical variable and requires a specific set of statistical analysis models like analysis of variance, whereas correlational research includes quantitative variables and requires its specific set of statistical models like regression analysis. Both causal comparative and correlational research are the simplest quantitative approach that explores causal and effect relationships, which involves a particular method of analyzing data to detect relationships between variables. And now, before we proceed to the simple truths about the new classification of non-experimental research, let's proceed first to give us a clear ideas about correlation and causal comparative research. This video, produced by Powtoon Animation, gives you a clear idea what is causal comparative research and correlational research is all about. So, upon watching this video, please read the following text. Here we go. So there you have it, ladies and gentlemen, a clear view about the causal comparative research. And now, to better understand the definition of a correlational research, or what is correlational research is all about, so let's have another presentation produced by Pau Tunes. This is all about the understanding about correlational designs. Again, please read the following text on the videos and enjoy watching. So there you have it, ladies and gentlemen, the work by Houghton. And it discusses about the meaning of correlational design. And now, let's proceed to our presentation about the new classification of non-experimental quantitative research. And we will now proceed to the simple truths about this correlational and causal comparative research. Now, let's take a look at the simple truths. What are the simple truths is all about? According here, causal comparative researchers do not use controls for extraneous variable. Another, the word causal is causal comparative does not imply stronger design. Another, causal comparative is a non-experimental research method. Another one, observing a difference between two or more means does not by itself imply causation. And the last one, general linear model cases like ANOVA and MRC can be descriptive, predictive, or explanatory. And now, let's proceed to the development of new classification of non-experimental research, which is our main topic for this day. It cut into two dimensions. The first one is the classification based on the purpose and objectives, and classification based on time. So, based on a review of 23 leading methods textbooks in education and related fields, he found a little consistency in how non-experimental studies were classified. He discovered over 2 dozen different labels being used, sometimes with slightly variation in the wording. The most frequently used labels in this text were survey, or 12 times, correlational, 10 times, descriptive, 8 times, and causal comparative, 5 times. As a result, a new categorization scheme consisting of two basic dimensions, each with three categories, were proposed. That is according to Johnson, 2001. And now, let us start with the first dimension, which is all about the classification based on the purpose or objectives, or dimension 1. The clearest way to classify non-experimental quantitative research is based on the major or primary research objective. In other words, determine what the researcher is attempting to do in the research study. Studies can be usually classified into the categories of descriptive research, predictive research, and explanatory research. The first one is the descriptive research, or descriptive non-experimental research, in which the primary focus for the research is to describe some phenomenon or to document its characteristics. Such studies are needed in order to document the status quo or do a needs assessment in a given area of interest. To determine whether the primary objective was description, one needs to answer the following questions. Were the researchers primarily describing the phenomenon? Number 2. Were the researchers documenting the characteristics of the phenomenon? And number 3. Where is it good? If answer is yes, then, without no manipulation, the term descriptive non-experimental research should be applied. A good example for this descriptive non-experimental research in the 39th annual Pi Delta Kappa Gallup poll of the public attitudes toward the public schools. It began as an effort to inform educators. The annual survey now provides information that has policy implication. Although the accumulated database can be used to track changes in attitudes about pre-K to 12 schooling over a long period of time, the design for each yearly survey is purely descriptive in terms of its purpose. Results are a descriptive representation of how the general public feels about different aspects of public schools. The next type is what we call the predictive non-experimental research, in which the primary focus for the research is to predict some variable of interest, typically called the criterion, using information from other variables, which is what we call the predictors. The development of proper set of predictors for a given variable is often the focus of such studies. To determine whether the primary objective was predictive, one needs to answer the following questions. First, did the researchers conduct the research so that they could predict or forecast some event or phenomenon in the future without regard for cause and effect? If the answer is yes, and there is no manipulation, then the term predictive non-experimental research should be applied. A good example for this, a study by Leslie Harplen and Thomas Dodson 2006 to develop a set of indicators that could identify women likely to report injuries related to intimate partner violence is an example of predictive study. They tried to develop markers that could be used in hospital settings to make predictions about likelihood of intimate partner violence. They identified two variables as potential predictors: injury location and responses to a standard screening questionnaire. They included them along with demographic variables in developing a prediction model. The last type for the classification based on purpose and objectives is what we call the explanatory non-experimental research, in which the primary focus for the research is to explain how some phenomenon works or why it operates. The objective is often to test a theory about the phenomenon. Hypotheses derived from a given theoretical orientation are tested in attempts to validate the theory. To determine whether the primary objective was explanatory, one needs to answer the following questions. Letter A. Were the researchers trying to develop or test a theory about a phenomenon to explain how and why it operates? Letter B. Were the researchers trying to explain how the phenomenon operates by identifying the causal factors that produce change in it? If the answer is yes, and there is no manipulation, then the term explanatory non-experimental research should be applied. An example of explanatory study was done to examine the relationships among the variables of attachment, work satisfaction, marital satisfaction, parental satisfaction, and life satisfaction. This research was informed by attachment theory, which describes parental attachment as a stable connection that provides a feeling of safety and security for the child. The researchers used 5 published instruments and present a very good description of reliability and validity for each one. So we're done with the first classification based on purpose and objectives. We will now proceed to the classification based on time. The first one is the cross-sectional research, in which the data are collected at one point in time, often in order to make comparisons across different types of respondents or participants. For a published example, consider one question addressed by Michael Hayes 2004, which was whether key actors in a criminal court case view complexity in the same way. The results of his cross-sectional comparison of the 3 key actor groups, the juries, the attorneys, and the judges, suggest that they do possess slightly different views on whether crimes are complex. Another is the prospective or longitudinal research, in which data are collected or multiple occasions starting with the present and going into the future for comparisons across time. Data are sometimes collected on different groups over time in order to determine subsequent differences on some other variables. And the last one is the retrospective research, in which the researcher looks back in time using existing or available data to explain or explore an existing occurrence. This backward examination may be an attempt to find potential explanation for current group differences. An example of retrospective study could be an examination of the educational background and experience of very successful teachers and less successful teachers. The idea is to look backward in time and examine what differences existed that might provide an explanation for the present differences in success. To the extent that such a study needed to depend on people's memories of relevant background information, it will be less accurate than if prior data were available for examination. These 3 categories could be seen as answer to the question: were the data collected at a single time point, across some time span in the future, or were already existing data explored? You could think of them as representing the past, which is the retrospective, the present, which is the cross-sectional, and the future, which is the prospective, with respect to timing of data collection. In short, it should be a past, present, and future study. Now, let's proceed to the new classification of research, or the combining the 2 dimension, and here we got. Since it is not good as it captured, let's take it one by one. Let's start with the first type, which is the descriptive retrospective. Using retrospective chart review, Anne-Marie Higley and Karen Morin, as an example for descriptive retrospective, describe the behavior of infants whose mothers had a drug history. Their findings supported the use of an assessment tool to guide parents in providing a supportive care environment to help infants recover. The second type is descriptive cross-sectional. So it is a combination of descriptive research and cross-sectional research. An example of this study was discussed earlier as an example of a cross-sectional study. It is descriptive because the goal was to document the extent to which The juries, the attorneys, and the judges, which are the actors, held similar or different views about a case. The results have implication for legal reform efforts. Another type is the combination of descriptive and prospective. An example of this is an investigation of the stability of test anxiety measures over time and testing formats with data collected at 3 time points in the academic semester, therefore making it prospective. The purpose for the description was to determine if test anxiety was a stable condition or if it is necessary to include a test anxiety measure with every test in a longitudinal study. Results indicated that it is not necessary to measure anxiety with every test. It is only necessary to measure anxiety in one test taking situation. Another type, according to Johnson, is the combination of predictive retrospective, and for type 6, the combination of predictive prospective. A good example of these two types is the two parts of this study were described earlier as example of retrospective and prospective studies. Both parts were predictive in nature, using a background and forward perspective to determine the extent to which electric blanket and waterbed use could be used to predict breast cancer. Although results did not exclude the small risk, neither analysis supported an association between breast cancer risk and use of electric blankets and waterbeds. The type 5 for this is what we call the predictive cross-sectional, or a combination of predictive research and cross-sectional research. In this study, it discusses an example of a predictive study, a one-time data collection use. The author's aim was to develop and validate a predictive model. They subdivided their sample using one group to develop their model and the second group to validate or test it. Their work produced a predictive and validated model of 3 components: risk of self-report of intimate partner, violence-related injury, the age, and the race. The researchers then hypothesized that these 3 variables could be used to develop a protocol to assist in the early diagnosis of intimate partner violence in an emergency department and outpatient clinical setting. For the type 7, a combination of explanatory retrospective. This study was explanatory because a goal was to further previous work on giftedness and knowledge and understanding of several related variables. The data came from a high school and beyond the database. A longitudinal study with a baseline information on 14,825 students who were high school sophomores in 1980. The data for this study included the base year and the third follow-up survey, 4 years later after graduation. The data set allowed for more comparisons than could reasonably be included in a single study. Variables were chosen that would either serve to replicate previous findings or expand psychological and behavioral profiles of gifted male and female students into more details. Our retrospective conclusion was that educational attainment differences of gifted males and females had their origins in the early high school years. And for the type 8, the combination of explanatory research and cross-sectional research. Already discussed an example of an explanatory study. This study was based on the data from the 15th annual survey of the longitudinal study that started in 1988 with 1,724 participants. About 1,200 participants were lost in the first 3 years. Only 108 participants were left for this study, which shows the dramatic attrition that can happen in a longitudinal study. Although the data were from a longitudinal study. These authors only used the 15 years data. Thereafter, it cross-sectional. And the last one is a type 9, the explanatory perspective combination. The authors suggested that assessing the predictive validity of an interest inventory is essentially answering the question, do early interest scores match one's future occupation? To answer this question, they did a 30-year follow-up of 107 former high school juniors and seniors whose interests were assessed in 1975. The first author had collected the initial data. Their results extend research on vocational interests, indicating that interests were fairly stable even after such a long time span. So there you have it, the 9 new classification of non-experimental quantitative research design. And now, I prepare here some examples of studies, and let's answer them one by one. The first one is, in this study entitled Tobacco Smoking as a Possible Etiologic Factor of Bronchogenic Carcinoma, in this classic study on smoking and lung cancer, the researchers collected data from 604 hospital patients with bronchogenic carcinoma and 780 hospital patients without cancer. These groups were matched on several variables. The data were collected through interviews, and past smoking habits were estimated based on the patient's responses to a set of retrospective questions, such as at what age did you begin to smoke? At what age did you stop smoking? How much tobacco did you average per day during the past 20 years of your smoking? The researchers showed that patients with lung cancer were more likely to smoke than were the control patients, and they were more likely to smoke excessively. The purpose of this study was to determine if the smoking of cigarettes was a possible cause of lung cancer. So based from this context, what do you think would be this context belongs to any type of the new classification of non-experimental research? Correct. That your answer is type 7, explanatory retrospective. Another example for this is in the study entitled Perceived Teacher Support of Students Questioning in the College Classroom, its relation to students' characteristics and role in the classroom questioning process, these researchers constructed a hypothesized causal or explanatory model of factors affecting students asking questions during lectures. The model included hypothesized direct and indirect effects. The researchers collected data from 1,327 students during a single time period, using a self-report instrument, and they analyzed the data using ListRel. So, what do you think now would be this context belong to the different types of the new classification of non-experimental quantitative research? Very good. And your answer is correct. That is type A, explanatory cross-sectional. Another one is a study entitled A Prospective Longitudinal Study of the Correlates and Consequences of Early Grade Retention. The researchers in this study identified group of retained students, or 32 students, and non-retained students, 25 children, that were matched on several variables. Statistical controls were also used to help further equate the groups. All of the children were followed over time, with the data being collected when the children were in the kindergarten, first grade, second grade, third grade, sixth grade, and again at age of 16. So based from this study, what do you think now would be the context belongs to the different types of the new classification of non-experimental quantitative research design? Excellent. And your answer is explanatory perspective. So there you have it, ladies and gentlemen, the different types of the new classification of non-experimental quantitative research design. As a conclusion for this matter, educational researchers currently participate in an increasingly interdisciplinary environment, and it is important that we use terminology and research classifications that are defensible and make sense to researchers in educational and related fields. One problem is that outside of education, virtually no one has heard of causal comparative research. Other problems are that the terms causal comparative and correlational refers to the very similar approaches. They are inconsistently defined and treated in current textbooks. They have been defined different over time, and the two terms ultimately suggest a false dichotomy as they are presented in popular educational research texts. A solution is to use a newer and more logical classification of non-experimental quantitative research. Virtually all researchers know the difference between description, prediction, and explanation, and they know the difference between cross-sectional data, longitudinal data, and retrospective data. These two dimensions make up the non-experimental research typology developed in this paper by Johnson. This typology should be useful in educational as well as in related discipline. In the end, I would like to say this quote from Mahatma Gandhi: "If I have the belief that I can do it, I shall surely acquire the capacity to do it, even if I may not have it at the beginning." With that, for your assignment, you need to write a brief discussion about the different types of the new classification of non-experimental quantitative research based from the presentation that I presented to you for this day. Submission will be next week, Friday at 5 o'clock p.m. This will be submitted through Yahoo Mail. So here's my Yahoo Mail: Joseph_Reyes2012 at yahoo.com. With that, I hope that you enjoy listening to my topic for this day. And without any further ado, I would like to say good day to each and every one.